Next Radio 2018 with Broadcast Bionics. Next Radio.
Good morning. Normally, just before someone talks about news, some plonker presenter has said, we'll be back in a moment. And that normally means listeners are thinking, well, what's going to happen? Where are they going? The radio station's shutting down. So thank you for all staying and not popping off for a coffee before I talk about the news. Good morning, I'm David Spencer. I'm currently head of news at TalkSport, Talk Radio and Virgin Radio, and also I lecture at the University of Westminster. And I thought I'd talk to you today about what is next for radio news. So radio news fundamentally hasn't really changed for years, decades. So when we were first doing it, the bulletin was structured very similarly to how it is now. So what has changed? Well, we've already seen from John some different figures about listening, and still most of listening is linear. But what has changed is no longer is radio the first place you hear the news. So when I got into radio, 8 o'clock bulletin in the morning was where you learnt what was happening in the world. But when I get up in the morning now, I've looked at Twitter, I've looked at whatever apps I decide to look at, and then the 8 o'clock news bulletin is a supplement to that. So the example might be England are playing cricket in Australia at the Ashes. I already know the score. So when I listen to a TalkSport bulletin at 8 o'clock in the morning, I don't need to be told that England were bowled out for 65 or something against Australia. I want to hear reaction. I want to hear more detail. But the style of bulletins really hasn't changed to take that into account. So I want to look at the way that we structure that bulletin. Now, excuse me when I go a little bit academic with these bits for a couple of minutes, but we all know about the inverted news pyramid, which is how news has kind of worked, certainly in print, for years, and is still how it kind of works today. So if you're putting together an article online, sorry about this, getting a bit excited with the animations. So if you're writing an article for online, you load the information early, you get people to read the article, important details follow, and lower down in the article maybe some less important information. And actually, while that is relevant to print, news bulletins are pretty much like that. We start with the big story, then the slightly softer story, and then we get down to the ha-ha at the end, as ITN would do, the dog on the surfboard. We all know about those stories, so you finish a bulletin with a bit of a smile, and it might be a bit of sport as well. In radio, we've tended to look at it slightly differently, and we have this sort of dramatic unity. So you start with the climax, then you have the cause, and then the effect being possibly some audio. So a little bit more of a circle within a story as opposed to that inverted pyramid. But actually, to me, the whole structure of a bulletin still feels very much stayed in that sense of that inverted pyramid. We are going to start a bulletin with the most serious story, get lighter and lighter, and then, like I say, finish with a bit of sport or something a little bit that will leave you with a smile. Now, to give you a little example, radio can be done differently and bulletins can be done differently. Yes, this is going to be a little bit of vanity because this is a bulletin from TalkSport that featured me a couple of weeks ago. And actually, the way I did the start of this bulletin was slightly forced by the lack of audio of the big breaking story, the story that led a couple of papers that day. So I had to think about what audio I had and how I therefore might be able to do the bulletin differently. Now, I'm not 100% secure how the audio will play, so wish me luck with it.
Here on TalkSport, it's time to get news and sport headlines. And the news comes from David Spencer.
Thank you very much indeed. On the way, shock revelation over Manchester bomber.
And Stevie G has standards, you know.
TalkSport.
4 years ago, this was the UK's High Commissioner in Malta, speaking after the Royal Navy rescue of people from the civil war in Libya.
Our top priority now is to give them the care and the support on their arrival here to ensure that they are treated with the utmost care.
Now it's emerged among those needing that care and support was the Manchester Arena bomber Salman Abedi, 3 years after he and his younger brother were saved from the fighting in Libya, he was blowing up 22 people in Manchester. He was being monitored by security services when he travelled to Libya, but his case was closed a month before that rescue. Charities are being accused.
So the reason to do that story that way was slightly forced by the audio that I had. But actually, you've told the story in completely the different way. So you've gone back to the historical clip and then done the facts after. I felt it worked, but then I'm biased because I did the bulletin. But it just shows you don't have to do it always in the traditional way. Now, we've looked at those figures from John earlier about how listening might be changing. So things like more people are listening digitally, more and more listening is going to be on demand. But those figures proved it, that most listening is still linear. So there is still a place for that Radio 2 bulletin that has that very strict structure of the top story, lighter, towards the end, because most people are still listening in that way. And most people on Radio 2's audience list maybe aren't necessarily on Twitter. Remember the stats about social media, most people aren't actually on Twitter. We will sort of focus a lot on social media today, but actually the stats are that most people aren't. So for a Radio 2 audience, those bulletins might still be the right thing to do, but they have stayed the same for decades. So what needs to change with that bulletin? What we need to ensure is that we add value. So when I talk to my team at Wireless, I say, if I am the boss, if I'm Rebecca Brooks, I'm going, why does the news team exist? What are we adding to the output? And somewhere like TalkSport, Talk Radio, are producing content continuously. So that audio needs to be used in bulletins. LBC are doing it, radio stations that have speech content are doing it, because there's always content being produced. So your bulletin should be distinct. Why would our bulletin on TalkSport be fundamentally the same as, say, 5 Live? So take that content and use it and personalize it. And therefore you create your own stories, your own leads. So be unique, distinct, maximize that content. So it benefits the station. It shows we've had great guests through the day. So if you're listening to Talk Radio, you're reminded about who's been on with Julia in the morning on breakfast. If Eamon Holmes has a big guest on the same story, perhaps you could go back and play some of the breakfast audio to set that interview up. So you need to maximize that content. Be distinct. Make sure that someone knows they're listening to Talk Sport, Talk Radio, or even Virgin Radio for their news. I'm not talking about styles of like the Howard Hughes 1990s type style. That worked then. It was very distinct to Capital. You can use personalities, but I'm talking more about making sure through content that you absolutely maximize what you've got. Obviously, multimedia is a challenge. You need it to be more than just a bulletin, because you're going to be putting stuff online. There will be social video. They'll be making sure that your guests that come in are tweeted. Extracts of those videos appear online. But use voices from the station that you trust. So in commercial radio, we've also been a little bit slow with this, that the BBC has done well for years, which is use voices that carry weight. So if we hire at Talk Radio a political editor, Ross Kempsell, make sure that he's producing content, social content, into programming, and into news bulletins that people will hear and trust. He's a voice that understands politics. He is someone who you would want to listen to find out information, just like it might be with Laura Koonsberg on the BBC. And you need to work to do that, to build up those brands and maximize that content. So, Virgin Radio, recently, we've been looking at how we do our bulletins for fairly obvious reasons.
On air, online, on DAB. This is Virgin Radio News.
I'm Jenny Barsby. Good morning. Chris Evans is returning home to join Virgin Radio. He'll present the breakfast show from the new year.
Okay, that's just a bit of a plug. If anyone missed that news, we have hired Chris Evans. Now, at the moment, Virgin Radio bulletins are actually recorded. So that'll be something we'll be looking at for Mr. Evans, I'm sure. But when we record those bulletins, we are looking to maximize that content and make it unique and distinct. So although it's 60 seconds, 70 seconds, and it's really very tight, you could still do 5 stories in that. But if you have a Westminster attack in the morning, a car drives into barriers outside the Houses of Parliament, make the whole minute about that story, about what is breaking. You can still do that in a recorded bulletin, a bit more like a flash briefing.
On air, this is Virgin Radio News.
I'm Jenny Barsby. Good morning. A man has been arrested and several people have been injured after a car crashed into barriers outside.
Okay, so that was the Westminster attack morning. I won't play that because we've got a big red thing in front of me that says time's up. So a couple of examples where things are done like I've described. If you want to check out a presentation about the BBC Minute, it's online from a couple of years ago from this conference, really interesting watch. And when I was chatting to Steve from the BBC about this, he talked about not just thinking about news, partly from a license point of view, in that the BBC couldn't describe it as news when they deliver it in certain countries. So it becomes more talkable stories. So we're talking beyond the trends, that temptation to go, what are the most clicked stories on the BBC website? Again, if we did that, we did the most clicked thing in news and radio news, we'd be talking about dogs on surfboards all day. So think about, though, what stories connect with that audience. And with a BBC Minute, very defined, very well produced, and shows what you can do with a recorded bulletin. Also, I spoke to the Daily Telegraph with Rob Owers there about their flash briefings. We know that that's a thing right now. And interestingly, Rob was saying that when he brought people in to do this at the Daily Telegraph, he wanted broadcast journalists, he wanted people like me who understood radio. They've looked a little bit at video, but the consumption of on-screen stuff via these Alexa-type devices is still very low, and the data doesn't really support it as an idea as yet. But he also thinks that broadcasters will ultimately dominate this market, because we have the resources to be able to do this and do it well and deliver a bulletin slightly differently for our audience. So what we have to think about in 2018 with news is, why are we there? What are we adding to the show? So the presenter doesn't say things like, we'll be back after the news, essentially giving you an excuse as to not listening, go and make a cup of tea and things like that. So we need to think about making that content more dynamic, using what we produce, and really, really connecting with the audience to understand what they want from a bulletin. That's the latest. I'm David Spencer. Thank you very much.